Ooh, that'll work nicely, yes.
That's not that spell book you found a while back, is it, Pruitt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying a couple things, that's all. Just don't move. Hold on. Percival!
Learned some new tricks since your last attempt to subvert my will.
Oh,
Pruitt.
well, you've been studying Abjuration.
Yes, I have.
Why don't we go ahead and talk about it on WebDM?
This episode is sponsored by Lasers and Liches, a complete Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition retro futurist sourcebook.
With new player classes, adventures, magic items, neon spells, code dragons, pizza slimes, keytars, dinosaurs, and they've even got freaking laser corgis.
This book is a complete neon overhaul of 5th edition that'll make you feel like you're watching cartoons on Saturday morning. Kickstarter ends on March 14th, 2019, and 400 pages of playtest content will be available to backers almost immediately after the Kickstarter ends.
This project funded in 30 minutes, guys. It's awesome. Check it out. Link here and in the description.
Okay, Jim, in defense of Abjuration, go. I mean, I guess, what is Abjuration before we start defending it?
Before we start defending it.
44 paltry little spells.
It is a school that, as I've looked into it and prepared for this conversation, I've come to appreciate more, and I like its eclectic and disjointed focus. It is a school with a strong theme, but if you're looking for mechanical consistency or the usual internal consistency to a D&D spell school, it's not here. Abjuration spells, according to the PHP, are spells that are protective in nature, although they have some aggressive uses. That would be spells like, say, Glyph of Warding, or they kind of like, blast the subject, protect an area, and cause damage to creatures while they're in it, that kind of thing. They can also create magical barriers, although not always, because not all the wall spells are in Abjuration.
Right.
But they're usually magical barriers that we're talking about here are those that are personal and protective in nature, shield, mage armor, things like that, or hedge out other spells, global vulnerability, anti-magic field.
Anti-life shell.
Anti-life shell would be another type of magical barrier. There's spells that negate harmful effects, right? Greater or lesser restoration, remove curse, things like that. In that sense, the negating harmful effects and some of the other things they do, particularly like banishing other creatures, it's almost kind of like a meta-magic school, like not in the sorcerer sense of like altering spells to create different effects or to change the parameters of a spell. It's spells about spells.
Yeah.
These are spells that affect other spells or spells that affect magical effects. So that is, of course, greater restoration, lesser restoration, dispel good and evil. I think it's another good one in that vein. Forbiddance, sure, is one like that. And then, of course, there are spells that also harm trespassers. Forbiddance, certain type of trespassers like that. The various guardian spells.
Oh yeah, guards and wards.
Guards and wards will do that, Glyph of Warding. All the ones that summon like a force or thing that sits somewhere, like Guardian of the Faithful or Faithful Hound or things like that, are also spells that can mess with and affect trespassers and the like. So these are obviously effects that could potentially belong in other spell schools. A lot of them summon magical energies that could be in conjuration or evocation or things like that. But
Faithful Hound is a conjuration, by the way.
My bad on Faithful Hound. But as you know, there's that's the one where there's a trio of spells that are all, I think, 4th level or 4th or 5th level that all do a similar thing. There's Guardian of the Faith, Faithful Hound, and then the Guardian of Nature is another one. That's a polymorph effect.
The one that has the guy that hangs out right behind you.
We'll get our spell names right one of these days. The school is very thematic, and in that sense, it's themed around protection, and it tends to be proactive. Right, so when you think maybe like, oh, well, negate harmful effects, well, like, why no healing? Like, why is healing's a harmful effect, or damages rather, and we might want healing to come from abjuration. Well, there is some healing there. Aid is an abjuration effect, and aid represents proactive healing, right?
Yeah.
A buffer before you really start taking damage. As an aside, the fact that healing magic can be found in like 5 different schools in 5th edition, I think speaks to the fact that we shouldn't see healing magic as coming from one source, and should instead look at healing magic as being something that a great many schools of magic have a contribution to, rather than just like all healing magic comes from the positive energy plane. And that's just a tangent for that. So,
Or could it be just there's different ways to access the positive energy plane? I mean, is aid just like a buffer of positive energy you put around yourself
sure. Oh yeah, yeah.
that represents the hit points you would have taken, but you don't?
It's in this sense that I see the schools of magic in Dungeons and Dragons as representing two things, and one of them is stated in the PHB, and that's obvious in the intent of the designers, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also the fiction of this school that has nothing, well, it has very little to do with what, you know, the people that design the game want. It has to do how it plays, because it might play a different way. And the way it plays suggests that the schools of magic are not just like discrete magical energies, but also represent practices and approaches and philosophies to magic that are then mixed with this magical force that's in the world. And Abjuration is one focused around protection, as well as a magic that affects magic. Counterspell, Dispel, anti-magic field, as we mentioned. That's a really powerful idea.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing that I think at first glance might get passed over is like, I got Mage Armor and Shield, I'm good. So, you know, I'll pick up Dispel and Counterspell, you know, at 3rd level when I get those, you know, but other than that, you know, you're over here in other concepts. They're, you know, dabbling with the forces of the universe and the like, and not necessarily spending time with Abjuration going like, well, this could be there are concepts here that could work really well in of themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
What are some favorite or standout spells in Abjuration for you?
The cantrips are lackluster. Right.
You mean all two of them?
Both of them. So I don't really start with the cantrips like we do with most of these. And so for first level, the big ones are Ceremony and Protection from Evil and Good. I know that Mage Armor, the collective gasp of not having Mage Armor and Shield being my favorite. They're not my favorite because they're ubiquitous. Yeah. And I get tired of the fact that it seems as though they are assumed and sort of like necessary, you know, and for me, they are spells I will take reluctantly on a wizard, begrudgingly, because I don't want to be hit in combat a bunch.
Yeah.
Which is why you would take them in the first place, and it leads me to think like, well, couldn't this just be an ability that mages get? If everybody's taking this spell, then maybe it is. But that's a different conversation to have.
Ceremony. Yeah, those are signature spells, Jim Davis.
I like Ceremony because it's multi-use. I like any multi-use spell. I
Yeah.
like any spell that has a lot of functionality. I like it because it's a world-building spell. It feels like a spell that would exist in these worlds. Then there are other spells that are like this across all the schools, and most of them either tend to be the ones created by players that ended up in the game. Bigby's Hand feels like a spell that a real person would have invented, because they're just like, I just love hands and I just obsessed with them and I gotta make a big magical one.
Yeah.
You know? And or like
Tarantino's feet. That's what he would make.
right, exactly.
Sorry.
They could just come and stomp and squish you up.
Monty's feet.
Tensor's Transformation is another one of those, right? Like it's or not just Tensor's Transformation, but all of Tensor's spells.
Yeah.
A wizard who wants to be able to carry things and be big and brawny, and the
Yeah.
like, you know. And so the Abjuration spells.
Wizard wants to be buff wizard.
Ceremony feels that way. It
Yeah.
feels like a spell created by someone that lives in one of these worlds, because they're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, I need to be able to bless these sorts of life events and things that happen. It makes the cleric a priest, right? It makes them an emissary from their god or goddess or faith that allows them to give a benefit to people. And you can really sort of see you know, the use of, say, Ceremony and minor curing spells and sort of like the low level beneficial and aiding type spells as being like the bread and butter magic that a wandering cleric might cast, you know.
Yeah, I got to cast Ceremony in a game not too long ago.
Yeah.
It was pretty great. It was a very weird scenario, but we had a makeshift wedding, and I cast it.
Yeah.
And then we killed the guy.
Well, I mean, but at least it was sanctified.
At least, yes,
Right.
at least it was sanctified by my God. I mean, the God of War. So,
Right.
anyway.
I can see there being parties who would attempt to abuse some of these things, but the benefits from them are rather, you know, limited and you know, you could also say like, yeah, well, you might have gotten married for the magical benefit of this, but that your God's still like, you guys bound your union with my magic, so that doesn't come without some kind of cost, right? You know. There's always consequences for that kind of behavior. So
I came for the magical benefit. I stayed for the companionship.
right, long-winded introduction to ceremony. Protection from evil and good is another big one.
Yeah.
I like it because I hate having my character be mind controlled, and some of the most mind controlling enemies are undead and fiends and things like that. So being able to hedge out those is good. I like it for paladins. I like it for any kind of like classically good sort of character. I like it for all kinds of wizards because they deal with extraplanar entities and things like that. An interesting spell to have, and I think a good protection spell because when you need it, you really need it. And as your character advances in levels, you start to go like, what am I going to do with my first level spells? And I see protection from evil and good as one of those that always stays on my list.
Yeah.
That I'm going to have it throughout my level. It's kind of like Fog Cloud or other ones where I'm like, this will always be useful. In terms of Abjuration magic, that's protection from evil and good. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like Sanctuary at that lower level, especially
Yeah.
if you're like either the cleric, you need to run around doing your cleric-y thing,
Yeah.
or if you want to be more of, you can get it cast on you as a wizard, and you're more of like a buff wizard, not really a buff wizard.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
you know,
We're bolstering others.
you're bolstering
and
others,
stuff, yeah.
and you're doing things to help your side.
Right.
I mean, having a sanctuary cast on you, that's to me a hell of a lot better than a shield or whatever.
Well, particularly if you're using your concentration to provide a benefit, and that's primarily what you're doing. And you could be casting other spells and contributing in that way, but maybe the spell that you're concentrating on is important enough that you don't want to risk losing it to damage. Maybe because you're summoning some kind of creature or something, or you're maintaining an effect that's allowing the party to exist in this particular location using a custom creation or something. Anything that we're like, I want the enemy to avoid me, Sanctuary's good for. So yeah, like that.
What are some other of your faves?
Glyph of Warding was a really fun one. They changed the wording on the spell. I remember when we first sort of talked about it, it was up for interpretation as to what sort of magic could be cast into a spell glyph on a Glyph of Warding. It seems like they changed the wording on it so that it's pretty clear. It's like you can cast spells that target creatures, spells that target areas. The Glyph of Warding will concentrate on this. It really is one of those spells where if you've got time and the resources to cast a lot of these and a place where you can have ready access to them, Glyph of Warding's there's just kind of like, well, there's always a fly nearby, or always a quick heal, or something like that. And because it bypasses concentration, you can get those combos that you weren't always able to get. And you can say, be running around with like a stone skin and invisibility and a fly, and now you start looking like a 3rd edition wizard.
Yeah.
Because you've say got a potion, a couple of glyphs, and then you actually use your concentration on something else. Would you say that we abused it in your Starward Bound game? Or not your Starward Bound, the precursor to Starward Bound, the first Spelljammer game.
Oh, you mean where
Our ships were covered
where
with glyphs.
you had your ships completely covered in glyphs of like healing and flying and
Yeah.
whatever?
And all, yeah. Well, but that started because we kept having crew members die for lack of healing, and then it was like, we'll just leave a lot of low-level healing glyphs about.
Yeah, and they know they can come over
and
here to this mast, touch this
touch
glyph.
this thing, yeah. And then it was like, well, they could also fly, they could also be invisible, they could also summon things, yeah. And we had like,
I mean, y'all did the work. You had the resources.
Sure. But also by the time we were of the level that was possible, that we would look at say 60 days of downtime while we were traveling between locations and calculating out and going like, yes, we have enough resources to cast like 12 glyphs. We'd also proceeded out of an area of play where like being boarded and having lots of like fights on our ship, which our white knuckle had left us. We were no longer that low level where we got to worry about being boarded by a crew of orcs. It's like, oh, there's a crew of orcs on this ship. It's just like yawn, like and so what I found was that the game kind of corrects this problem for itself, because by the time you can abuse this spell, you've passed out of the realm where abuse of the spell would be a big problem, and are now sort of like, well, yeah, who cares? Like, well, I mean, somebody could attack us at our castle. You guys had the castle in Board of the Dragon Queen game
Oh, the
a long
one up
time
north?
ago, right?
Yeah.
The one that's in the Mirror of Dead Men, and I remember you guys talking about setting all those glyphs around the teleportation circle and like being ultra paranoid that the Cult of the Dragon was going to teleport back into the castle and take it back over, and like a hallway lined with glyphs on the ceiling, the walls, all kinds of triggers.
Yeah, we went kind of nuts with that.
Yeah, it never came up. Yeah.
I just assumed they were scrying on us. And
they
they
saw
saw
you
that,
trap
and they
it
were
out.
like,
nah.
in which case, It worked.
I think at the time I figured that they would assume that that's what had happened. You know, when your enemy takes over a castle that you have, that has your teleportation circle, it's a risk to go back there. You know, it's a risk. So they just decided not to risk it. Planar binding's a fun one. Lots of things you can do with planar binding.
yeah.
And of course, you need a lot of different. I think it works well for multiple casters, right? Where multiple casters are there, one person conjuring the creature that's to be bound, another person's concentrating on that, on protecting everyone else and keeping that creature contained in the magic circle, and then there's the caster who's like binding it to this reality in the terms of service. I think it's fun from a player, sort of like a group of PCs where, maybe they have to summon a terrifying and horrible creature. And you'd want an Abjurer around for that, right? Like you'd want someone there that's able to deal with these creatures. And any for you, like any that stand out?
Well, I mean, I've always been a fan of Warding Bond, played a lot of low-level clerics, and Warding Bond is just a great one to throw on either the really squishy guy in the party, or if you have an absolute tank, if you want to make them like an uber tank, throw a Warding Bond on your Bear Totem Barbarian, where half of the damage that has already been halves again.
Right.
And
I think I've been a player in one of those where we've been like a paladin, and first off, having damage with a paladin is nice. It's like
we
being
did,
able to do
did that in Curse of Strahd.
That's what
we
we
did
did.
it literally all the time.
Yeah.
Because life cleric, I'm healing myself when I heal you.
Right. It was a Devotion Paladin and Life Cleric was a fun duo for that, and a lot of Abjurations were, it was a duo that like really lent itself well to a lot of Abjurations because we were going to endure fights.
Exactly.
And, but basically playing 2-player in a module, you have to kind of like approach combat and those kind of challenges a bit differently.
But the fact,
but this kind of magic allows that to be possible.
Yeah, but the fact that it's 8 hours and no concentration. I mean,
it's nice.
Come on,
no concentration.
For giving someone resistance to all damage. Basically.
Well, and that's the sort of thing right there, because it provides this damage resistance, but it doesn't have concentration itself. And when I look at a spell like Stone Skin, and I go, okay, the damage mitigation that comes from that, it's like, but I'm still taking some damage, making me having to roll that concentration check. Now I'm less likely to take Stone Skin and cast it, say, on myself, and more likely to cast it on someone else who could benefit from having something like that. And I think it's maybe similar with Warding Bond, except you don't have the the concentration component that Stone Skins has.
And then I would say the other one got to be Counterspell. But we need to do a deep dive on Counterspell, because Counterspell, it's that spell.
Yeah.
Right? It's like was introduced in 5th edition, right?
There is a history of counterspelling throughout Dungeons and Dragons, and I remember
with readying a dispel.
Yeah, rules for it in 2nd edition. In 3rd edition, it was if you had the exact version of the spell, you could counter a spell with that version, or if you had Dispel Magic, you could use it, and there were subclasses based around it, but I don't remember anyone ever counterspelling in 3rd edition. I don't know if 4th edition had it because I didn't play enough 4th edition, but it's sort of like one of the big standout spells of 5th, and one of those that seems to cause a lot of contention and headaches and people who don't like the type of gameplay that overuse of Counterspell provides, and then those people who don't like the fact that it sort of like shuts things down. I'm on the fence about Counterspell.
Yeah.
I have a skepticism about any spells that seem like they're must-have, because to me that suggests that other spells that are there in that share the same level with them could maybe use a boost or some love to get them to be cast more often. Mostly just because you get tired of seeing the same spells cast all the time. You want some variety. It's a spell that works, or it doesn't. Now it doesn't have to, right? There's a roll if you try to counter something that's higher level, and then but even that touches on several things about the way this spell interacts with the game mechanics that are fuzzy and require some DM adjudication and require some conversation between player and dungeon master, or in this case, probably party and dungeon master. Just because it's like, are we going to announce what spell is being cast? I don't usually. I usually just say it looks like your enemy's casting a spell. And if there's a circumstance that would allow a player to have some insight into that, I'll offer that information. But to me, in my mind, that normally would require them having either knowing that spell that's being cast, like, oh yeah, that's this particular spell, or having like detect magic up and seeing the energies of magic being gathered before they're released, and being able to identify the spell. There are the spell identification rules in Xanathar's Guide, but they take a reaction, which you then can't use for your counterspell.
Yeah.
So
You have to have the one guy doing his reaction. He's casting a fireball,
yeah.
and letting this
And then
guy
letting the
use
other
his
guy do it,
reaction
yeah.
to counterspell.
Maybe that kind of teamwork is, what you're in for. And consider this, right? Like, you might be an Abjurer wizard who's really good at getting counter spells and having them low-level counterspell land on a higher-level spell, but you don't want to use your reaction. And you also don't have that great of an Arcana, right? Because even though you're an intelligence caster, you don't have expertise or something in Arcana, unless you're an edge case that can get that. But maybe you have a lore bard or a knowledge cleric or something in the party that can get better scores on their Arcana check to sort of notice that. And then it is a matter of a teamwork. That this one, they're like a savant for identifying a spell as it's being cast, and then relaying that information. That's one way to approach it if you want to use those optional rules. I like the fact that it's a gamble. First off, it's a reaction spell. It's a snap decision. I see magic being cast and I work quickly to unravel it. You don't know if what's being cast is a cantrip. You don't know what's being cast is a powerful spell. The only thing you would know about it is if you have to roll, it's higher than 3rd level. But even then, I wouldn't reveal that information until the player told me what level of spell they were going to use for it. To me, that is a powerful curb on abuse of counterspell.
Oh, definitely.
Right? Like, if the player doesn't know. Now, there are people who will say, well, that's not an informed choice on the player's part. And I would counter with like, well, yeah, it's a risk reward. You don't know what you know you're stopping something. You don't know what.
I'm going to counter. No.
And then that comes up with the other issue of it, right? Which is that can you counter the counterspell? Can I cast Fireball? Counterspell. Counterspell the counterspell. And if you follow sage advice and the like, then the answer to that question is yes. It's 2 different types of actions. Therefore, it falls under...
It's a defensive spell so powerful that it conjures its own micro-universe of actions.
Right, yeah. And we've talked before about, what that might look like. And the counterspell duel can be boring only when you're just talking in terms of the mechanics. And this is a moment where, as a dungeon master, you might set aside and go, okay, we know this just happened. Let's talk a minute to see what this looks like, and share a moment where we imagine this world that we're creating, and go like, all right, I'm forming the bead of fire in my hand as I'm about to hurl it out, and it will explode. All right, the enemy caster, sends a ray of cold at you to attempt to abort that process and stop it, and you block that yourself by increasing the intensity of the fireball right before you unleash it, and it goes off. Like, that's just the narration of it, and even taking just that little moment to role play out and describe the back and forth can do a lot to sort of alleviate this. I do this thing. No, you don't. No, you don't.
No, you don't.
No, sir, you don't.
You start to have the inverse of that moment in Blazing Saddles. Mr. Johnson is right.
There's a cheesy option that I've seen. I've never had anybody try it, but it involves the specific wording of readied action and how readied actions work with regular spells, which is that you cast it and then you hold it because you're having the concentration. You have to hold concentration on this spell that you've got. So you would cast it out of line of sight of the person who would be doing counterspell, and then you step into line of sight after the spell is cast to release it. But to me, that smells like stinky cheese, and it's one of those things where being out of line of sight is a good way to stop someone from counterspelling you, but being out of line of sight is also a great way to not have spell targets to select for your own magic.
That is true.
That's the benefit of it, right?
Another good way? Being a sorcerer, taking subtle magic. Let me tell you, there was nothing more fun than countering everything while just standing there holding my staff.
Yeah. Being able to get rid of verbal and somatic components is a big deal for spell, and I think with the counterspell like you're talking about, it does. First off, what it makes me want to do is make like an Abjurer 17 Sorcerer 3. Yeah. And just they've got both the the benefit of being like a high level wizard, the benefit of being a high level abjurer, plus the subtle spell and probably like heightened spell or something like that. Whichever one gives them disadvantage on saves. That might be the other one I take for that particular build.
Yeah, I think that's heightened spell.
Yeah. If you're telling your players what spells your enemies are casting and they're savvy enough to know what level those spells are and are making their counter spell choices based on that, then you're kind of like stacking the deck in the favor of them abusing this particular spell. And if you just said like, yeah, they're casting a spell and that's it. So that's sort of my fix for it, is to keep that in the dark and make it a bit of a gamble for the player. Counterspell's a big one, but
Counterspell's a big one, but I mean,
most categories are pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like the option of like anti-life shell. First off, I just love that name.
Yeah.
Anti-life shell. Being able to hedge out anything alive.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful.
Pretty powerful, yeah.
I need some me time. I need
Right.
some me space here,
Don't
right?
get it, yeah.
Like that or anti-magic field, which is it's a big gamble, right?
Right, it's a big gamble. And I start thinking about like the kind of caster who would have a spell like that, because you're basically like shutting off your own ability to cast spells. And so is there a situation where you might use that? Maybe you like sort of sacrifice your ability to cast spells to like make sure the uber bad lich is really taken down, or something even worse than that relies on magic.
Well, I mean, it's the dedication to a single spell, which one can do with counterspell. I have seen that done, where you have the caster literally is like, I'm saving all of my slots
just
for
to
this
shut
big
down other casters,
because we're fighting a big badass caster, and anything he casts, I'm going to counter it, and I literally am just going to.
Cantrips, one of my action.
What are you doing
for counterspell?
Well, yeah, what are you doing for your action? Either a cantrip or Blade Ward.
Yeah, something like that,
and then wait for them to cast.
Yeah,
and so that's a completely viable way to play that. And let me tell you, it worked to perfection. It frustrated the DM to no end, but he was like, I can't be angry at somebody who's going to like be that strategic.
Yeah.
But doing that with anti-magic field, I mean.
Yeah,
it's pretty high level.
It's pretty high level. You got to be up close. You are sacrificing your own ability to cast magic, but at least anti-magic field goes into very in-depth, like what it covers and what it doesn't, how it works. It's a very in-depth spell. It's just very situational. I also kind of think it's antithetical to the caster, because like the caster is about magic. So when I think about the spell, I start thinking like, what influence does that have on the caster? Especially when we start thinking like, for wizards, the magic is in their mind. It's a part of them, right? Like sorcerers sort of like call it up and can create these effects seemingly, just from their being. Warlocks are granted the knowledge of the spells through their patrons, and similar with sort of like connection with nature for druids, or the divine with clerics. But for wizards, it's like your spell's a part of you, right? So what does it mean to have an anti-magic spell as being a part of you? Like, is it like a hole in your being that you're always aware of and you just can't wait to get it out? How does that affect you?
Yeah, I would imagine it would basically open a black hole in the area around, and it just sucks all magic into it. So for the caster, it would be a very turbulent thing, whereas there's a stillness in the weave around it.
Yeah, it clearly doesn't not like completely anti, like no magic period full stop, because there's sort of like the background magic of D&D that still persists, but it is an unraveling of the magical foundations of magic that has to have some kind of effect on the mind of the caster.
Right. Well, I see that as more of affecting worked magic and not magic that just permeates, is.
Yeah.
Like these are like
worked effect.
Yeah, it worked only on the things that have been changed, been altered by magic.
Right. Some concepts, right?
What are some more concepts?
I like the idea of a censor mage, and so a censor is like I'm thinking to like say the Roman system of government. This is the stage that you would progress to after being a consul and proconsul, and sort of like a venerable censor. So you not only took the census, but you're also kind of there to enforce certain norms and customs and the like. You're there to kind of keep tabs on people, make sure those nouveau riche, aren't getting up to something they shouldn't be getting up to, like work, like owning a business, that kind of thing. Or I'm thinking of like the censors. In the imperial bureaucracy of some periods of China, where it's there, there's an elaborate bureaucracy, and sort of like entry into it is incredibly difficult. But there's also this class of official that's there to keep tabs on others and to make sure they're doing their job. And you might not know that they're coming, and you might not know that they're there, but they work for the emperor himself. And so I see the idea of a censor as being like almost like a court mage. And they are the wizard or mage that keeps other casters in line. They're the one that goes, what are you guys doing over here? Yeah? You guys got some diabolical texts? Huh? You guys got summoning some devils over here?
What you guys studying?
Right. That looks like just some innocent earth magic over there. Okay, move along. And it's this sort of a cop wizard, basically, right? And
Well, it sounds like the Daily from Avatar. Right?
Sure, right. They could be like a secret society. This could be any number of things. I've had campaign worlds where all of the wizards sort of got together and agreed, like, hey, there's certain things we're not going to do because we don't want the rest of the world turning against us. We're not going to mess with kings and emperors and the like. And politics is for mortals. We're concerned with more weighty matters. And in that sense, a censor would be someone that sort of enforces that. But I've had other settings where the wizards rule the roost. It's a mageocracy, and in that case, the censor is a literal court wizard who works for the magical emperor empress and. They're there to banish demons, send extra-dimensional creatures home that shouldn't be there. They're there to protect the realm, as it were.
From the workings of magic.
From the workings of magic. And so in that sense, they need a robust magical skill set that offers a lot of tools for them to deal with different threats and protect them. And Abjuration seems like a good fit for that.
Yeah. Sounds a little bit like the Thought Police, too.
It certainly could be, right? Like, there's a lot of sinister undertones to that.
A little more divination, but still.
Sure, but there's abjuration, divination. They're sort of close thematic cousins in some ways, because how do you protect yourself without knowing what the threats are? And isn't the best protection knowledge of your enemy, and the best defense a good offense? So an abjurer worth their salt will have a wide variety of spells at their disposal from many different schools of magic. And it's only a particularly hidebound and narrow-minded mage who would only stick with one school. What kind of caster are you?
Well, I mean, there are different viewpoints of magic.
Sure.
And that could be just the segue we need to move into this last point.
Oh yeah. I get what you're saying.
Which we've been covering all these schools.
Right. So this is the last of the magic schools that we're doing here, and we started this back in sort of early 2018. We'd just gotten done with the class series, and I was like, well, I want to stick with a series of D&D shows, but I don't necessarily want to dig deep into character mechanics that much. It's kind of burned out on it. And I was like, let's take a deep dive into the magic schools, and what is it that they are doing? How do they work? The second genesis for this was a series of blog posts on the Legendary Pants blog called Project Arcana. Yeah, and it was it's their sort of look at the spell schools of D&D, and I was sort of inspired by a different take on the spell schools, and are more concerned with internal consistency and reshaping the spell lists to achieve that consistency. I kind of realized that I saw the inconsistencies as a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
And they suggested a world in which magic was complex and messy and not a cut and dried, observable force that can be measured and the dimensions of it can be taken. But the fact that so many of the schools seem to be thematic in focus and are there to fulfill a certain narrative purpose, I wanted to reverse engineer that and think of like, what does this mean for the world that they're in? Right?
I was going to say, what would you say to someone who said Jim Davis sounds like he just cast rationalization?
It is a rationalization. It's there to take what some would see as an inconsistency that bothers them and says like, I hate this. Why aren't all the fire spells in one school? Why aren't all the X spells in this? Why is it that Abjuration can summon all of these other effects? All the things that we went into in Evocation that we could say about so many other different schools, and we have in some respects in all of them. To say like, what if that just reflects the changing nature of magic in this campaign world? For instance, some spells switch schools between editions. What if you take that idea that sometimes a healing spell's in this school and then sometimes it's in this one, and then depending on the edition it could be in another, and you look and say like, what if through the course of your campaign history's world, the dominant form of healing magic has reflected the cure wound spell as the school that it's from, whether it's necromancy, conjuration, evocation, whatever. That represents a moment where that's the dominant way of thinking about healing magic. In the case of 5th edition, there's healing magic in 5 different schools, right? Like evocation, transmutation, conjuration, abjuration. I could have swore there was another. Necromancy has the raised deads, right? They have like sort of bringing people back to life. False Life, though, could be considered. It's tagged Vampiric Touch, right? So those are they have the healing tags, at least in the D&D Beyond database.
Hit points change place.
Sure, and so like all of those represent different approaches to healing magic. What does that mean about your world? Are there competing philosophies of magic that have different cycles of influence in your campaign world history? Do the schools also represent certain guilds or as their name suggests, actual schools of magic? A place where you go to be taught a particular philosophy and approach in order to achieve a certain effect. Not necessarily a scientific way of like, oh, we're studying the force of conjuration in the world. We're like, no, this is the school of conjuration, one of the oldest and most venerable schools. And here we learn about the finer points of moving things across the planar boundaries and summoning them to us, and that maybe that influences the personality of the caster, the way that they approach situations outside of magic. All of those things can be reflected in your campaign world, and you can build lore and history and eventually conflict based on that. In terms of just inconsistencies with the spells themselves and the fact that some spells seem to belong in one school and are in another, or produce an effect that would suggest they belong in even multiple schools. Let's take a spell like Imprisonment, 9th level spell. It's got a variety of effects for it. And those effects might be conjuration-based, transmutation-based, they might be enchantment-based. There's all different ways in which you could organize this spell, particularly ones that have lots of different effects. And so that leads me to believe that what we need in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition are multi-school spells.
Yeah.
Spells that really embrace the fact that they draw on multiple schools' approach to magic and philosophy of magic to create an effect. And that a spell that combines, say, conjuration and divination is a spell that maybe summons a spirit of knowledge and binds it to you for a time that you gain some benefit from. And or it conjures a being from the future that you question and have a conversation with in order to gain some insight into your present. And those are the sorts of effects that when you start thinking of multi-school, and as you get into like creating your own spells and making your own magic, subject for a future episode, then you can expand your conceptual horizons for what magic can do by looking at it as like, stop worrying about the consistencies and just accept that these are thematic focuses, and then build from there.
Yeah.
And then you can have you can do a lot of really interesting things. Like, what does that suggest about your world, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, and the thing is when it comes to inconsistencies, this book was written by people, and in a meta sense, there are people in these worlds, so there's going to be very weird, different viewpoints on how you can achieve a certain effect.
Oh, sure,
right?
And not just the current iteration of Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. We're talking about the D&D is at this point in its existence. It owes a lot to everyone who has ever had a hand at the wheel to shape this. And from 1974 onwards, it's been shaped by multitudes of people and the fans as well, right? Not just the game designers and developers at TSR or Wizards, but people who've played it. Yeah. And the people who've played it have had an impact on it. And so it's going to produce inconsistencies. It's going to be weird. It's going to be jumbled. It's different generations of D&Ders are going to emphasize one thing about the game they like over another, and that's always going to piss off those who are still around from the prior generation of gamers. And those things, though, we can use that. And instead of railing against it, saying like, why isn't it like this? Why isn't it more like that? Why can't we like have a more internally consistent? And if you do, please go check out that Project Arcana. Seems like they did a really cool job with bringing some consistency to it over there. But for me, I like the inconsistency because it suggests something about the world that I like. Yeah. It suggests a world where cadres of wizards, beat each other up in street brawls. Magic is such a part of a caster, right? Why wouldn't it be the defining thing about the casters, sort of like their approach to magic, as exemplified by the spell schools or by the type of caster they are, cleric, druid, etc. That's one of their defining features, and you owe it, player or DM, to like really dig in and think about these things and have conversations with each other about what that means for the world and how you want to portray this. And that's how you build shared investment and get a game where everybody's like gung-ho about,
Yeah. I guess it's fitting we saved Abjuration for last to build a good defense for the schools of spells.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm 100%. Like I might have started this journey kind of like, these inconsistent spell schools, but by the end of it, I'm like, yeah, these inconsistent spell schools, like, aren't they great? Like this is what they add something to the world rather than detract from it.
Head on over to Patreon for our weekly podcast and so much more. WebDM is also on Twitch with 3 weekly games, which we upload to WebDM Plays, our second YouTube channel.
I forgot some of the concepts we didn't get to there. Like, I think the cool concept, maybe Travis can use this for like a sting or something. It's like a glyph mage, right? Like a rune mage, right? Like to me, the Abjurer as a wizard is really cool for it because you get that like HP buffer, which you can describe as like runes on your armor or something, or if they're like a mountain dwarf, you know, that gets the AC or the armor proficiency, or a demon ghost hunter mage is another kind of cool one that's like I hunt ghosts. I'm an exorcist kind of thing. Like arcane exorcist.
Oh, by binding them ghosts, banishing them.
Yeah, binding ghosts, banishing.
Like you're the not holy guy.
Yeah. You're the ghost.
You're Constantine.
It's like or Constantine is kind of like that, or like there's some like kung fu tropes, like character tropes that are like that. These sort of like the wandering mystic, where they're sort of, you know, they're like maybe a monk, maybe not, maybe a sorcerer, maybe not. But if you got ghosts around, you want this guy on your side. Yeah.
Because they certainly are not scared of any ghosts.
There used to be a ghost puncher monk class.
Ghost punch.